I'm Brock Dickinson. I'm the entrepreneur in residence with the Faculty of Environment at the University of Waterloo, and I've been asked to talk today about SDG 17, Partnerships for the Goals. And I've titled the presentation Beyond Words, because I think, partnerships is one of those words that we kind of bandy around a lot, we use frequently, and often it's a bit of a platitude. And I think one of the things we really need to focus on as we think about how to work towards the successful implementation of the goals is how to move beyond those platitudes and into the genuine sort of introduction of actions and ideas and projects that will lead us in positive directions. I do want to start today with a bit of a land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you from the Niagara region of Ontario, which is on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. It's also an area covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, which is an international accord that says these lands will be shared by all peoples. As I think about the Sustainable Development Goals and Goal 17 in particular, I sort of reflect on some of my first reactions to the SDGs. I was a big fan of the Millennium Development Goals. I saw the power of and the potential of using these things to coordinate international activity. But there was a sense as we moved into 2015 and these new SDGs that there was a lot of kind of hype and marketing spin to this. And I wasn't always sure what was really behind these goals and how meaningful or how powerful they would be to us. And part of that relates specifically to the notion of goal number 17, partnerships for the goals. It seemed odd to me that we would have a goal entirely about working on the goals. And so there was this sense in the early days that I wasn't entirely clear what SDG 17 was all about. Shouldn't we have partnerships for everything? Shouldn't that just be built into the way we approach the goals overall? And so there were a lot of questions in my mind about what Goal 17 was actually meant to accomplish. And I think we can get some clarity around it as we dive more deeply into the UN's kind of documents and guidelines around the individual goals. So although partnerships for the goals is used in a lot of the marketing materials as the explanation of Goal 17, when we look deeper into the documentation behind it, we see that the actual goal that's expressed is to revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. And that idea of revitalization is pretty interesting. It suggests that somehow we have stumbled or we have fallen behind or we have fallen away from the things that we should be doing collaboratively and cooperatively, that somehow we are not as good at being partners as we may have been in the past. And I think that's a powerful and compelling idea. It's not just about the fact that we need to work together for the sake of working together, but this notion that we need to be working together in more creative, more effective, more productive ways. And that this is something we need to move beyond just assuming is in the background of all of the goals, and is actually something that sits at the forefront of how we think about the goals as a set. And underneath that notion of revitalizing the global partnership, there are a number of specific objectives attached to Goal 17 in the original UN documentation. And they talk about how revitalization of the global partnership will require us to think about a number of key ideas. It's going to require us to think about how we mobilize human resources and the systems around that, how we utilize financial resources and investment. It talks, for example, about our failure to maintain promised levels of international development assistance. Goal 17 specifically talks in the background materials about how we use technological tools and the development of new technologies to further the goals. And it talks about our institutions, our organizations, and the capacity building that we have to do if we're going to take on real and meaningful roles in pursuit of the goals. So there is this sense that there's more meat behind the scenes than we might expect from that first glimpse at the titles of the individual goals. So why am I, as an entrepreneur or an entrepreneur in residence, being asked to speak about this particular goal? Well, in fact, I think there's some really interesting connections that we can start to make between sustainability and entrepreneurship as we scratch beneath the surface of this goal in particular. So what I'm showing on the screen here at the moment is just that definition that I've just gone through of SDG 17, building on direct quotes out of the UN's material. And I think one of the fascinating things about this definition of Goal 17 is that it matches very closely with the UN's initial definition of sustainable development, Way back in the 1980s, the UN published a report from the World Commission on Environment and Development called Our Common Future, which actually invented the phrase sustainable development. It's hard to imagine, all these years later, when this is now a phrase we use all the time, but it was actually the creation of a committee. And in that initial committee report, they provided the very first definition of what sustainable development is. They said it's not a fixed state of harmony, but a process of change in which the exploitation of resources, the direction of investments, the orientation of technological development, and institutional change are all made consistent with future as well as present needs. Most of us are somewhat familiar with that definition now, but what fascinates me is how directly that definition of sustainable development parallels what we're talking about in Goal 17. Almost word for word, in some instances, we've got this sense that these two separate ideas, divided in time by more than 30 years, are using the same language to say we have to do something really important. So what does that have to do with entrepreneurship? Well, let me switch this out again. We look at that definition of sustainable development and put that next to a sort of a standard textbook definition of what entrepreneurship is. Again, we can see some really interesting parallels and some really interesting connections between these concepts. In some sense, much like sustainable development, entrepreneurship is about taking resources, whether those are human resources, financial resources, or technological resources, and mobilizing them to create new and powerful structures that allow us to bring new ideas and new inventions into communities and into the broader marketplace. So intrinsically, there is this sort of a connection between sustainability and entrepreneurship. And I think, in some sense, we can kind of understand how that connection relates to the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of the goals have very obvious connections to entrepreneurship. If we think about the creation of good jobs or the eradication of poverty, entrepreneurship can certainly be a part of the solution there. For other goals, if we scratch beneath the surface, the role of entrepreneurship starts to become clear. If we think about objectives around clean water or affordable and clean energy, we're going to have to invent new tools and new technologies to achieve those goals. And in some instances, the most effective or efficient tool for mobilizing those new tools will be entrepreneurial structures. And as we look at some of the broader goals, things like an economic system based on responsible consumption and production, or the kind of climate action we need to really affect positive change in our broader economy, those are also things that will rely on a rethinking of entrepreneurship and the way we launch and direct new business ventures. And so instinctively, I think we know that there's these connections with entrepreneurship. But as we look at Goal 17, I think there are actually more direct lessons that we can take from the entrepreneurial field that will help us understand what partnerships for the goals should really be about. And part of this comes from the notion that entrepreneurs themselves, as they launch their ventures and their businesses, whether these are traditional businesses or social enterprises, entrepreneurs are often required to form and broker and nurture lots and lots of partnerships. There's the partnership between the founder of a venture and the funders of a venture. There are the partnerships between entrepreneurs and the mentors who give them advice and hold their hands through the launch and startup processes. There's the partnerships that have to be created between companies and clients to sort of create mutually beneficial relationships. And in many instances, we see sort of peer-to-peer partnerships where entrepreneurs work together to support each other and to support each other's ventures. And what this means is that network creation becomes a key component of the entrepreneurial journey or the entrepreneurial experience. So much so, in fact, that when we think about how we create facilities and systems to support entrepreneurs, things like incubators and accelerators, we often try to create spaces in those facilities to allow the accidental collision of entrepreneurs so they meet each other and create new networks and create new partnerships. We deliberately support entrepreneurs in a way that says we need to develop more robust and effective networks for entrepreneurship to be effective. And I think that means that entrepreneurs have thought about networks in a way that has led to a lot of insight and information that could be really valuable for those pursuing the Sustainable Development Goals. And for Goal 17 in particular, when we start to think about what does a revitalized global partnership start to look like? And I think one of the first things we can take away from the entrepreneurial experience is the notion of what a network actually is. And at some level, that seems like a fairly simple thing. We all know what networks are. We talk about them every day. But stripping it down to its most basic pieces, we can start to think about how we could build more robust networks. So a network, in a sense, is just that tool or that structure that allows two or more people to connect. And at the very simplest sort of iteration of that idea, networks are just two nodes connecting to each other. That I can network with one other individual, and that's still a network. It's still allowing me to do something interesting and allowing me to kind of leverage the value of a connection with another person. But networks can also be thought of in more complex ways. One of the very early ideas around networks is something that's referred to these days as Sarnoffs Law. So David Sarnoff was the founder of the National Broadcasting Corporation, NBC, what is now a major television network in the States. And as he tried to describe how his network could work, because TV networks were a brand new thing. It started as a radio network originally, but that also was a new thing. Sarnoff sort of described what came to be known as Sarnoff's Law as the way of understanding the value and importance of the network that he was creating. Basically, he said the value of a network is determined by the size of the network. So in his case, the value of NBC was determined by the number of listeners originally and viewers later that could connect to the broadcast that he was sending out. And the more nodes that he could make within that network, the more valuable the network became. Now, one of the fascinating things about Sarnoff's Law, of course, is that this network was a one-way system. It only worked in one direction. Sarnoff and NBC sat at the center of that network and could broadcast out. And although it became a very valuable network, it was limited by that kind of constraint. We see the evolution in the 1960s and 70s with the arrival of telephone networks and later the internet, of a new concept of how networks could be valued and the kind of role that they could play. And Sarnoff's Law began to be replaced by what was known as Metcalfes Law. Robert Metcalfe was the creator of the Ethernet technology that sort of lies at the foundations of many of our IT systems today. And he suggested that rather than just the kind of the value that relates to the number of nodes in a one-way system like a television network, the increased interlinkage of our communications tools allowed us to think about value in a different way. And this was the notion that if you had two-way communications within a network, then your network started to become infinitely more valuable. It wasn't just that you could broadcast information in one direction, it was that information could start to move in multiple directions. And the larger the number of connections within a network, the more valuable it became. So a telephone network, for example, that had two telephones in it only has one connection that's possible. But the number of connections grows exponentially every time we add a new telephone. By the time we get to 5 telephones, there are 10 possible connections. By the time we get to 12 telephones, there are 66 possible connections. And by the time we invent the internet and we have millions and millions of connections with information flowing in multiple directions, we can start to see that the value of this network is immense. And so one of the lessons that we learn from this entrepreneurial space and these ideas is that the more effective we can be at creating two-way interactions within our networks, the more valuable and effective those networks become. But that wasn't the end of the story. After Metcalfe came a fellow named Jeff Reed, a computer scientist and a professor at MIT, who coined what was known as Reed's Law. And he basically said that one of the things we didn't anticipate about the internet was that it grew the value of networks even more than Metcalfe's Law said it would. So it wasn't just about the fact that we could create multiple nodes in a network and feed information back and forth in multiple directions. It was this notion that within a network, we could create lots of subnetworks or specialist networks. And that in fact, at any given time, every one of us could be part of multiple networks looking at multiple kinds of issues and questions. That as the internet developed and as our technology-based tools accelerated, we were able to do more and more through the networks that were already established. And that dramatically increased the value of those networks. And so by thinking about networks from this perspective, we can start to say it isn't just about communications in one direction. It isn't just about communications in two directions. It's about how we manipulate and manage information across these vast networks of networks to allow us to mobilize resources, ideas, capacity, tools in support of the things we're working towards, including the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, networks are something that most of us are probably familiar with to some degree. I'm pretty sure that 99% of those who are sort of watching these presentations are signed up on LinkedIn and have some degree of a network on LinkedIn. But I think one of the things that these laws teach us is that it isn't enough to just kind of become a node in a network, just to have a membership in LinkedIn, or to be able to log into LinkedIn is really not that effective. That networks require mobilization, that we need to think about how to take advantage of those various laws and those network effects that I've just talked about. And there's some really interesting research just emerging that helps us think about how we might do this. So Marissa King is a professor of organizational behavior at Yale University. In January of this year, she published a new book called Social Chemistry, in which she uses LinkedIn as a tool for talking about how we could more effectively utilize and mobilize networks. And part of what she reflects on is the fact that we operate and act differently within networks. We don't all use networks the same way. And King suggests that, for example, people tend to fall within three broad groups as they create their LinkedIn networks. There are the expansionists, who tend to have large numbers of contacts, but with generally fairly shallow relationships. These are the people who are really good at growing networks. There are the conveners, who have a relatively small number of network relationships, but often have deeper relationships. And these are the people who can bring trust to networks and systems. And then there are the brokers, who link people from different network types. As we think about Reed's Law and all of those different specialist networks and subnetworks that we want to try to connect together, the brokers are the ones who have feet in these different worlds that can start to bring them together. Now, King suggests that none of us fall strictly into one of these categories, that we actually sort of sit in between them. We have little bits and pieces of all of them in the way that we approach things. But as we think about how to mobilize partnerships in support of the Sustainable Development Goals and how to build better partnerships in particular, I think we can start to draw some interesting ideas from these discussions. First, we need to create partnerships by leveraging existing networks. Inventing a new network can often be counterproductive. It only has a small number of nodes. It's just those two telephones with only one connection between them. And so working with existing networks becomes a great way to further our goal of better partnership. Secondly, we need to maximize the value of the networks that we're using by taking advantage of the forces behind Metcalfes Law. It isn't about who has the biggest network. It's about how we connect and link together these very active, very sort of tangible activities that individual subnetworks and specialist networks are already engaged in. So it isn't about mobilizing everybody. It's about finding the most powerful partners and tools to do the specific things that we're trying to do and linking those kinds of networks. And it's also about this notion that as we build networks, we need to think specifically about the different roles that individuals play within those networks. Where are the expansionists? Where are the conveners? Where are the brokers? And how do we entice them and encourage them to play their specific roles in the networks that we're trying to create? It isn't about everybody doing the same thing, but it's about recognizing where our particular skill sets and that the value of our particular ideas might lead us as we create more and more powerful partnerships in support of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think ultimately that suggests to me that, goal 17 is not about gathering around the campfire and singing Kumbaya. It's not this notion of, we should have partnerships because partnerships are good. In fact, there's something much more tangible, much more explicit, and much more concrete behind the goal. And my hope is that as we move towards 2030, we'll think more strategically and more creatively about how to implement those goals. I do think there is a great starting point for that in Canada. There is a structure already in place called the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. This is an organization of universities and research institutions across Canada and linked to SDSN chapters around the world that is already in place. And if we can start to more effectively find ways to take our sub-networks and our specialist networks and connect them to the work that SDSN Canada as a broader network is already doing, then I think ultimately we'll be much more successful in pursuing and implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. So reach out to SDSN Canada. I hope this notion of networking with existing networks and building powerful new partnerships is a compelling one. And I wish you all the best of luck in pursuing those opportunities.